All right, good evening. We'll go ahead and start. Thank you for joining our webinar this evening at George Mason University's Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship. Our webinar tonight is Data Revolution, 5G Wireless, and Impacts on Real Estate. Data and mobile and wireless communications are growing in importance as more of our personal and business lives move online, especially as we've experienced during the pandemic. With the rollout of game-changing 5G wireless technology, astute real estate professionals understand the critical impact on tenant needs and building competitiveness. In a sign of things to come, a large real estate company, JBG, recently purchased their own broadband spectrum for a major Northern Virginia development, National Landing. So tonight, we're going to learn about 5G wireless technology from a non-technical perspective and understand the implications for real estate investments and development. Our speaker, Len Forkas, has a rare combination of expertise in both the real estate and wireless industries. But first, let me introduce myself and the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship. My name is Eric Mary Bojic. I'm the director for the center. The center is George Mason's platform for real estate education. We have a master's program in real estate development, a real estate minor for undergraduates, plenty of non-degree and certificate real estate programs, as well as educational programming like the one we have tonight. None of this would be possible without the support of the members of our advisory board. These are the leading real estate companies and organizations in the Washington Metro DC area that support the Center and George Mason's efforts at real estate education and collaboration with the real estate industry. If you're interested in supporting real estate education at George Mason University, you can email me at rmariboj@gmu.edu. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker on Data Revolution, 5G Wireless and the Impacts on Real Estate. Our speaker tonight is Len Forkas, the president of Milestone Communications. Len has over 30 years of experience as an entrepreneur in both the real estate and wireless industries. He has led Milestone Communications' growth since its formation in 2001, with the development of over 200 communication towers in the Mid-Atlantic region. In 1996, he formed Milestone Communities, a Washington, D.C.-based development company, and has held management positions at Bank of America, Weyerhaeuser Real Estate, and Oxford Development. He is also a past trustee and board member of the Urban Land Institute, Washington, D.C. chapter. Before I turn the screen over to Len, I'd like to remind everybody that if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will then answer the questions after the presentation. So please don't hesitate to put your questions down there. So without further ado, I now turn over the screen to Len.
Great, thank you, Eric, for that kind introduction. I appreciate being given the opportunity to kind of share some of my thoughts regarding what's happening today in the wireless space, wireless industry, and how it may relate to people in the real estate industry. By no means am I an expert at how wireless technology is integrated into buildings. I'm a former land developer, apartment developer, and retail developer, and I kind of stumbled into the wireless business 20 years ago when I built my first tower in a project I developed up in Germantown called Milestone. I love the business because it's very much a vertical, it's a real estate business, building cell towers and leasing vertical assets such as rooftops, water tanks, other types of assets. It's a great industry because even though we only have 4 or 5 wireless customers in the region, they all have great credit, they all pay their rent on time, and once they occupy a tower or a rooftop or an asset, vertical asset, they stay there for a long time. So I'm not really going to be able to share the details and plus I'm not an RF engineer, and I really can't tell you the first thing about how RF engineers propagate 5G signals. But what I will try to do today, my goal today is to try to like make it relatable in terms of what I'm seeing in the space that I'm in managing hundreds of assets, as well as building and owning hundreds of assets. So I come to this with the approach of as an owner, so what I'd like to do, my goal today is when everybody's done watching this webinar, my hope is that people come away with kind of a basic ABC understanding of what 5G is all about, how wireless networks kind of function, and what the benefits are associated with being up to speed with where things are going. Because the one thing I've learned in this industry is if you get bored, just wait 6 months and everything will change rapidly in terms of the technology, in terms of what the priorities are and so forth. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take the screen and share with you a PowerPoint presentation that I have that will, excuse me here, what's up? Okay, so hope everybody can see that. Eric, we good?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, awesome. So these are the key questions I want to answer today. So number one is, what's 5G? How does it work? Who's building it? Who's paying for it? And what's it mean for real estate? As real estate developers, real estate investors, real estate people in real estate space, those are the key subjects I'm gonna cover today. So let's get started with the first one. So what is 5G? So 5G was created by the United Nations. The United Nations has an organization called the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. And what they decided to do back in 2012, once the 4G standards were established, was to create a mechanism that would allow for all the brain power in the world, all the engineers in the world to work together to create a standard for the next generation of wireless networks. I don't know if you remember when 4G came out, but there were two versions of 4G. One version was called LTE, which stands for long-term evolution, and the other version was called WiMAX. And they both function relatively the same, but it appeared as though LTE had higher strengths. So all the money and engineering time that was spent to create the WiMAX technology, the WiMAX hardware, the WiMAX software all fell to the wayside. And all of the wireless companies throughout the world went to LTE. And so the goal of the United Nations was to make sure that they didn't have a winner and a loser in 5G. So they effectively created a mechanism, a process that took 4 years to develop the different stages and phases of what 5G would do and how it would function, what software would be written, so that the manufacturers of the equipment like Nokia and Samsung and Ericsson would all be able to make the equipment based on one standard. And so when they set out in 2012, 2013, they had 4 major goals that they wanted this technology to do. The first thing was they wanted it to be 20 times faster than LTE. LTE pretty much maxes out around 100 megabits per second, which, by the way, is pretty darn fast. It's about as fast as most connections people have at home. They wanted it to be over 1,000 megabits per second or a gig per second, and potentially up to 10 gigs per second. So that was the first criteria. The second was they wanted it to have very low latency. So if you're on your 4G phone right now and you're trying to download a video or watch a high-def sports event, you're coming in at around 50 milliseconds. That's the latency. They wanted it to be a fourth of that, and even lower. And so the design standard was between 4 and 12 milliseconds. And then the third was devices. So if you were to take 1 square mile of Fairfax County, pick a place, and figure out how many wireless devices were in that space, whether it's an iPhone or a tablet or whatever, or it could even be a smartphone, a smartwatch. Imagine in that space, there's a certain number of devices that are connecting to a wireless network. They wanted this 5G technology to connect to 100 times more devices in that same area. So we're talking about the capacity to connect millions of devices within a very small area. So that was the third thing they wanted to shoot for. And then the fourth thing was to reduce the energy that's required to be able to receive and send a signal on 5G to 1/10 of the current amount of energy that's needed today. They wanted a 90% power drop to have a device in the field connect to the 5G network. So you're talking about having, as a very simple example, a 10-year battery life on a device. That was what they were shooting for. So, I've been in this business for 20 years, so I remember when there were no Gs, or just one G. But this graph kind of just shows you the evolution of the networks, where my first phone when I started was in a bag that connected to a cigarette lighter, and I had a magnet with a pigtail that I put on the roof. Of course, that was voice. When 2G came out, that's when the Blackberries came out in the early 90s to the late 90s, when you could single-digit text or very, very rudimentary. Obviously, 3G technology, we all remember, was mostly able to allow us to be able to have devices that would send email and photographs, but not very big files at 2 megabits per second. And then the real leapfrog was the 4G. When the smartphone and 4G came about, it was the perfect fit. The smartphone was the perfect fit for the 4G technology, because the two hand in hand could do absolutely amazing things. And that was when we were able to connect. The average 4G connection in 10 years ago was around maybe 5 megabits per second. Today, I'm getting 30 to 40 on my phone, my 4G phone. It can go up to 100 or more, actually. But the 4G really was when we got the cloud in our phone and the internet in our phone. And what 5G does effectively is bring fiber to our phone. That is what 5G does. To be able to connect at a gigabyte speed on a wireless network is as fast or faster than anything that we can get on a wired connection. And so that is kind of my graph of kind of how I describe the transition from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5G. So how does it work? Well, it works the exact same way that 3G and 4G work. It requires infrastructure, and it requires hardware, and it requires spectrum. So the things that we see in the landscape outside are predominantly small cells. Now we're seeing these in cities and light pole replacements, where these are devices that are owned by each wireless carrier. So Verizon has their own small cells, and that's different from T-Mobile's small cell, which is different from AT&T's small cell. But effectively, it's a network. It's a RAN network that is exclusive to the wireless carrier. The second form of outdoor infrastructure is called distributed antenna systems, or DAS, and this is an example of an outdoor DAS. And behind those panels that you see in the second graph, where it kind of looks like a brown garbage can on top of a utility pole, there are multiple antennas that can allocate capacity to every one of the 4 or 5 wireless carriers. So that is owned and operated on average by a private company, such as Crown Castle or American Tower. There are lots of companies that have developed distributed antenna systems. If you live in Fairfax County, you see these along roads like Fox Mill, Hunter Mill, Beach Mill, and places where it's very, very difficult to build larger scale towers. And those are called neutral host, which means that inside those panels, any wireless signal can be communicated through those panels through a network of software that is managed by one entity or one company, versus solely managed, like a small cell is managed by a company like Verizon exclusively, or AT&T and so forth. So that's the big difference between small cell and the DAS. Small cell is operated, installed, and owned by the carrier, whereas the DAS is on average owned, operated by a third-party company that then hosts the wireless companies to plug in their network to distribute their signals through those brown antenna panels behind the panel there. Then the third is what we call macro. And there's two forms of macro. Macro that are on existing structures like rooftops. And then, of course, there are the macro antennas that are located on wireless towers. That's an example of one of the types of towers that we build at Milestone. Each carrier requires at least a couple feet of separation. So on average, the separation on a tower is around 10 feet. Each carrier has different antenna panels, depending upon what the frequencies that they're using, what job they perform. On average, I won't get too deep into frequencies, but there's three types of frequencies. There's low band, mid band, and high band. And the higher the band, the smaller the antenna. The lower the band, the bigger the antenna. So if you see those big fat antennas on that tower, those antennas are 8 feet high. They're about 2 feet wide, and they spread a signal very far at very low frequencies. Whereas the skinnier antennas are typically the mid band or the higher band. Those signals don't go as far, but they're much denser and carry much more information. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of what's going on outdoors. Indoors, inside buildings. Again, we have distributed antenna systems that are neutral host that can send out a signal from one antenna for all of the wireless carriers. There are small cell programs or installations that are exclusive to one carrier. I'm going to go into a little more detail on CBRS, which is an acronym for Citizens Band Radio, which was spectrum that was recently auctioned off this summer, and that allows for private networks to operate on private spectrum. And then, of course, we all know Wi-Fi that's in our buildings. I think the one thing that I'll talk a little bit about later is who pays for the indoor systems. And on average, it's not so much the carrier, it's mostly the building owner or the tenants pay for the installation of these indoor systems. So who's building these networks? Well, these are the companies that are building the 5G networks right now. Predominantly the big four. Now, we had a merger that occurred this past April where T-Mobile acquired Sprint. And as a result of the approval from both the FCC and the Department of Justice, they were required to help stand up a fourth wireless company. And that company is called Dish. You may know Dish as a satellite TV company. Charlie Ergen, the CEO, very progressive, innovative person, has been purchasing wireless spectrum from the FCC for over a dozen years to slowly build the necessary toolkit to be able to create a wireless network. They now have 10 million new subscribers. The other result of that merger was Sprint had to sell to Dish, a company called Boost Mobile. But from the standpoint of scale, each Verizon is the biggest, T-Mobile second, AT&T is third. They all have between 60 and 100 million subscribers compared to Dish, which has 10 million wireless subscribers. They also have millions and millions of television subscribers that they anticipate and hope will come on board their network as they grow and build their network from scratch. Dish obviously is building a network from zero, and that takes time and takes money. So the FCC and the Department of Justice again negotiated a deal whereby Dish can use the T-Mobile network at a very low cost while they build their network. So Dish has a 7-year window where they're permitted to use the backbone, the infrastructure and software and the antennas for T-Mobile, but they eventually have to wean themselves off that, and they have a very aggressive timeline to do that. So right now, if you're in the tower business or in the rooftop leasing business, you're super excited about Dish because they are now in the process of beginning to make decisions on where they locate their network on both rooftops, towers, other vertical assets. And of course, there's other smaller companies like Chantel and US Cellular that are more regional. In this market, in the Washington, D.C. market, we don't see them as much because they don't have spectrum in this market. but we do see them in more rural areas and other parts of the United States. So those are the usual suspects. Each of them spend an average of between 20 and $30 billion a year on their network. So 5G, so, we're talking about the next generation, and it took about 4 years to build the 4G network from 0 to 100, right? And, but in doing so, and of course in managing and operating, all 4 of those companies have invested, $500 billion of capital to build the 4G network. And again, the 4G network is capable of speeds way, way more than what most of us use. And so the story is not over for 4G. And what's interesting is when 4G came about, the value proposition of 4G was embodied in the smartphone. The smartphone, the marriage of the 4G network and the smartphone gave us Uber. It gave us one-click purchasing on Amazon. It gave us navigation. For those of you that remember a device called a TomTom or a Garmin that you used, and you had a suction cup and you put it up on your windscreen so you could find out where you're going. Well, of course, the combination of 4G and the smartphone with Google Maps, Apple Maps, and Waze effectively buried those devices. And so what happened was that capital investment was made to develop the 4G network over a 4 or 5 year period of time. And the smartphone was the magic that made 4G really function. And the smartphone on the 4G network created more innovation in this industry than at any time that I've seen in terms of how it's changed the way we live, from the ability to have social media in our pockets, to be able to transmit large video files seamlessly. And so it became very clear that people would pay for the 4G equipment, and that's why that $500 billion was invested, was because our phone bills went up, because we got a higher value from our devices. And at one point in time, we paid by the megabit, and we had to buy more data as we ran out of data or used up our data bucket. That all changed about 3 or 4 years ago when T-Mobile and Sprint introduced unlimited, and the other carriers, AT&T and Verizon, had to come on board. That was a painful moment for them, but the question is, what does this mean for 5G? And when we talk, we talk about the race to 5G. And so what I'd like to just kind of, the seed I want to plant with you is the race to 5G is not how fast we can build the 5G network. When the White House talks about we have to win the race to 5G, they're not talking about how fast we build the network. What they're talking about is how much of the network needs to be built so that the innovation can occur in America. Because let's face it, so many of these companies, Uber is an American company. It has a global footprint. And so as a nation, we want enough of the 5G network to be operating so that that innovation can occur here in our soil. That is what we talk about when we talk about the race to 5G. Because make no mistake, before the pandemic, I've visited China 4 times. And of course, they have no zoning in China, so they build cell towers wherever they want. And from Shanghai to Shenzhen to Beijing, those networks are up and operating with 5G signals. So it's pretty clear that from an infrastructure standpoint, China is winning on how much 5G infrastructure has been deployed in the universe, but the innovation, we have yet to see the real innovation yet. And that's where we talk about the race to 5G. And the question is, for all those wireless carriers, is no one really knows where the money is going to come from to pay for 5G over an extended period of time until that innovation occurs. And therefore, it's anticipated that the transition from 4G to 5G is going to take a lot longer than it did for the transition from 3G to 4G. There are other companies that have their own brand of wireless connectivity, from Charter, Xfinity, and then of course there are other companies that are out there that are in the wireless space that are either in satellite or are looking at investing in more wireless. We call them MVNOs. They're called mobile virtual network operators. Charter, Xfinity, Comcast, Cox, they all operate on the backbone of companies like Verizon and AT&T. GoGo has their own satellite network. Starlink, which is Elon Musk's company, is launching hundreds of satellites a year. But so, you know, again, you get bored in the wireless space, just wait a few months, and technology changes, innovation occurs, and there's always something fun to look out for. So what are the immediate uses of 5G? Well, again, what are we talking about? We're talking about low latency. We're talking about very fast connective speed. We're talking about very low battery life. And so what that means is, for example, in vehicles, we're talking about devices in the automobiles that will sense what's happening in the environment around them, so that your car will know when the light's going to change as you approach it. Your car is going to know who's next door and how fast they're going, and whether they're about to turn or not. Your car is going to drive for you eventually over time. I think one of the things that we talk about when we talk about driverless cars is if you go to Pittsburgh and ride in a driverless car, which you can do right now, that car will stop at an intersection at the same reflexive rate as your brain. So if you're driving a driverless car and it sees someone walk in front of you, the car reacts about as fast as you can react in seeing that person walk in front of you to hit the brake. When latency goes from 50 milliseconds to 6 milliseconds, that decision is made in a fraction of the time that it takes a human being to make that decision. That's when driverless cars become more safer than in a car with a human being, because its processing speed and its ability to act is so much faster than the human mind. And that's what's fascinating about what's happening in vehicles in terms of the ability to create safer experiences for people that drive through driver assisted. We see that today in the technology already. In medical, you know, we're going to see super high def imagery, and you think about how big a file is for a CAT scan. You know, could that be a CAT scan file? You know, can be downloaded in seconds. Remote surgery, you know, it sounds pretty far-fetched, but with low latency, in the 4 millisecond range, anybody that's a gamer knows that the lower your latency, the more real the experience. Well, what will happen right now, there's hundreds, maybe thousands of robotic surgery devices that are operated by humans. And, you know, it means that if you have a heart condition and you live in, you know, in Louisiana, and the best surgeon to fix your heart is in Chicago, they'll be able to do that without anybody traveling, because of 5G, because of the low latency of that network. The other immediate uses today are going to be machine to machine. We call it IoT, or the Internet of Things. And these are when machines, again, operating on very low battery power, are able to sense what is happening in the universe, whether that's you know, the temperature in your building being calibrated to the number of people that it scans. You know, we're talking about the ability to be able to have devices communicate with one another seamlessly with very little battery life. And you know, I won't go too deep into smart cities, but all this is all part of the notion of creating places where people live and work, where the technology creates for a very robust user experience. And so what does it mean for real estate, and for real estate investors, real estate building owners, and so forth? So again, I'm not an expert on the technology wireless technology inside buildings, but I can tell you, having been a tenant in a building in Reston, that the ability for me to connect to a wireless network and a wired network was amongst the highest priorities for me. If my internet goes down and I don't have wireless backup, because internet does go down, if I don't have good wireless backup, everyone in my office goes home. Now, of course, everybody's home already now because nobody's working in an office building. But when things do get back to normal post-COVID, wireless connectivity in your space is a deciding factor for many tenants. And then, of course, the amount of technology in a building from the standpoint of what can be done and what can be monitored is a huge element. And in residential, it's public safety, IoT. To dig a little deeper in commercial, for example, in urban areas, the driving force behind the wireless networks are macro sites, which are my towers or installations on rooftops. The CBRS technology, which is just rolling out right now, it's effectively private Wi-Fi. Right now, Wi-Fi is effectively a spectrum that anyone can use. CBRS is a type of Wi-Fi that's more secure, but the spectrum in which the information flows across through the airwaves is licensed to particular owners that bid for that spectrum. AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Dish, all own their own spectrum. And so, which means their networks are absolutely secure. No one else can transmit a signal on the spectrum that they have purchased from the FCC. And those purchases have occurred over the last 30 years. 30 seconds on spectrum. The way you can visualize spectrum is back in the day when we had AM radios in our cars, we would like turn the dial from like 600 to 610, and that would be a sports channel. Then you go to 611, you'd lose it. Well, that 600 to 610 is a band of spectrum. That radio station is broadcasting a signal. So the wider the spectrum, the better and clearer the signal. And that AM spectrum is at very low frequency. Remember in the old days, maybe I'm dating myself here, but when FM became big, FM was so much clearer and so much crisper. And you go to the FM channel, which is a higher band spectrum, and the sound was so much better. Again, you turn the dial and you could see where the FM channels were. The FM channels were much smaller. They weren't from 99.1 to 99.30. It was 99.1 to 99.2. And so they were tighter bands, but they had way more capacity. We call it a mid band. So again, the lower the spectrum, the further it goes, the more you need, and the less crisp or clear it is. The higher the spectrum, the cleaner it is, and it doesn't go as far, but it's much denser. And that's based on the length of the radio waves. So again, that's more than you need on spectrum, but CBRS is private spectrum. And then of course, small cells, which we showed you what small cells look like. Those are owned and operated by each wireless company. So in urban areas, you're gonna see the combination of macro, CBRS, and small cells. They are going to enable building systems such as HVAC and security and lighting and artificial intelligence that can scan, cameras that can scan facial recognition and heat in loading the HVAC inside the buildings, and of course the Internet of Things. The other thing that's happening is the National Fire Protection agencies, international firefighters agencies are all creating indoor standards for communication so that the networks, the wireless networks that the first responders use can function inside buildings that have big core factors. So there's new things that are happening where buildings will need to be in compliance with those new standards. And of course, in urban areas, denser public venues, such as convention centers or downtown DC, where you have big parks, that's where the investment's occurring, and that's where the innovation's occurring. In the suburban areas, macro and CBRS excuse the spelling there, are mostly the way in which the signals are being done. There are some small cells in suburban areas, but they're mostly in very high traffic areas, like where shopping centers are located. And then we do see distributed antenna systems where macro is not effective. So go to Great Falls and try to build a cell tower. It's pretty tough. You go on Beach Mill Road or in Potomac, you'll see a lot of the signals are propagated by those types of devices I showed you a picture of, which are on top of wooden poles and so forth. This is where wireless companies, those 4 or 5 wireless companies, are making investments. They're making investments in macro, CBRS, and small cells, but what they're not doing so much is investing in putting this infrastructure inside buildings. For residential, the same. The multifamily, they're building the macros, the CBRS, the small cells. Of course, in multifamily buildings, security is a major factor, as well as it is in commercial, fire, HVAC. But the other thing that's happening now with 5G is that now that the speeds are so robust, 5G will compete with cable. 5G will compete with broadband as an option. And so I think that's one of the benefits of having good 5G connectivity in your community, whether it's an urban multifamily or urban office or suburban multifamily and suburban office, is that you're going to have choices instead of the usual suspects on fiber or cable. You're going to see the wireless signals being as fast and potentially as affordable once they begin to roll out. In the suburban areas, in single-family communities, that broadband wireless, again, it's going to be nice to have a wireless choice, but pretty much the suburban areas are covered mostly by macro sites, the kind of sites that we build. And then, of course, how does it all functions with fiber and data that's housed in real estate. Fiber is absolutely the most critical component for enabling 5G. And so if you want 5G in your building and you want to have that installed, you have to have a very robust fiber network that will support it. Just as a point of kind of a visualization, the average megabit of data travels an average of 1,000 miles from point to point. So from the point that you click the phone to order something on Amazon, the data is routed and then it routes back to confirm your purchase. That megabit, that bit of data on average travels 500 to 1,000 miles in distance. And so what's happening is we're seeing now that the latency and how fast that can travel, obviously the further it travels, the slower it travels. And so the notion is if you can move the data closer to where the user is initiating it, you can reduce the latency. And that's where we're going to be beginning to see data centers move from Ashburn, move from the major corridors into places where there's high demand. There's micro data centers that are being developed right now by American Tower and Crown Castle at the base of cell phone towers. We're going to be seeing more data centers being housed in places where there's high office populations. Again, it's somewhat nascent right now, but again, the idea is that if you can reduce the latency, you increase the quality of the experience, and that's where edge data, I think, is going to. And again, I'm not an expert on edge data, but I know that the trend is moving toward getting data closer to where the users are, whether they're in their homes, buildings, or near cell towers. And I think that's why the major analysts that cover our industry, the wireless industry and the infrastructure industry, also cover the fiber industry and the data center industry. All 4 industries are completely connected at the hip when it comes to their growth and their success and the trajectory of their success. One last thing I wanted to talk about was CBRS, which is kind of a fascinating case study that's happening right now. So again, CBRS was a form of spectrum that was allocated by the federal government through a company called Federated Wireless. And CBRS auctioned off bands of spectrum this summer. I think they raised around $5 billion. Who bought it? Who bought the CBRS spectrum? It doesn't go very far. It only goes like 1,000 feet. but all the major communication companies bought it. AT&T, Verizon, Dish, T-Mobile, Comcast, and Charter bought them as well, and because they can distribute the CBRS through small antenna panels. But also smaller companies like Windstream and Frontier, wireless internet service providers bought it. These are tiny companies, small companies that provide internet service in rural areas where there's not good connectivity. It's too expensive to bring fiber or cable. Utility companies or major users bought CBRS spectrum so they could operate their equipment on a private network that they own that has security. And then enterprise, universities bought it. Companies like John Deere and Corning bought it. And again, to increase the speed in which their equipment operates in their manufacturing plants and so forth. But as Eric said earlier, one of the most fascinating things that I've ever seen was JBG bought a large, I think $5 million of CBRS spectrum at National Landing. And I had an opportunity to talk to the folks at JBG as to what the method was to their madness in making a $5 million investment in spectrum. And so you guys may have heard there's a little company that's going to be occupying space at National Landing. It's called Amazon, and they have a very strong appetite for connectivity, as well as all of the companies that provide resources to Amazon. But what JBG's strategy is, they want to create National Landing as a innovation incubator for the future of wireless and wired connectivity in that geography. And they want to lay out the footprint, and they're working with Verizon and T-Mobile and AT&T and others to build out the 5G network on their rooftops, to build out the network in their buildings, to build out the network on the street corners for 5G. Because what they want is they want all those innovative companies that are going to create the next Uber, create the next Waze, create the next life-changing device or software or app that uses all these benefits of 5G. They want to happen in their backyard. And so they want to lay the foundation for a Uber smart city. And they bought the CBRS spectrum so that they could roll out their own wireless network that can be used by their tenants that will go at lightning speed, at 5G speed. So I thought that was a very innovative event that's being planned for that community. Not all of us have the resources to be able to do this type of thing, but also not all of us have the tenant like Amazon's headquarters coming to their buildings. So it's going to be a very interesting case study to watch. I've been droning on here, no pun intended that drones require 5G networks, but I'm droning on here. But one last slide I want to share with you, and that is two movies that were filmed many, many years ago. First was I, Robot with Will Smith in 2004. And that was when the first movie that I remember seeing that had automated driverless cars driving. And that was projected to happen in the year 2035. The second movie that came out right before that was Tom Cruise in Minority Report, Steven Spielberg, where you could see he was manipulating data. There were drones flying in the air, collecting information, obviously driverless cars, driving in 3 dimensions. And in 2002, we assumed that driverless cars and that drones flying around, from place to place would all be something it would take 50 years for us to get to. So I think that this slide, just to me, in my mind, just kind of demonstrates how we think about science fiction and how long things take. Well, guess what, folks? These are here. These things that were depicted in these movies are here today. Less than 20 years later. And so with that, I am happy to answer any questions that you may have, and I'm gonna stop my screen share. And Eric, hope I didn't suck all the wind out of the room.
No, not at all. This is all good stuff. One question, maybe I'll start off with a few questions for the audience. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the Q&A. So one of the questions from the Q&A session had to do with Amazon, with JVG and Amazon. Hopefully, Len addressed that just a few minutes ago. So one question that I had was the 5G services that are being offered today, and we see them all the time now in advertising. How does that compare to the 5G network that was envisioned with all the standards that you described 5G should have? Is that just an early version of 5G that's just for consumers, or is that something that is already rolling out 5G in its full capacity and full, all of its characteristics?
In 2018, about 90% of the 5G standards were approved. And companies like Verizon and AT&T started marketing 5G. And so, but what they were marketing was their version of 5G, because the final version of 5G had not yet been agreed upon. And so a couple of years ago, we started seeing advertisements for 5G. And so, and then we even saw on our phones the 5G E on our phone instead of LTE, which was 5G evolution, which is the transition to 5G. So there was some software and some hardware that was manufactured to the standards that were established as of that time. But since the fall of 2019, all the standards were complete. There's no more work on 5G, to my knowledge. There may be some, maybe 5.5G that maybe people are thinking about. But right now, all the manufacturers have the information to create the hardware and the antennas and the equipment to deploy the standard 5G software. So 5G, there's no multiple versions of it anymore. It's one technology, and now it's slowly it's being rolled out. But 5G rolls out on it behaves differently based on which spectrum you use. If you use the low band spectrum is not very dense, but it goes miles. And so that requires a certain type of antenna, and that signal is propagated, but it's not as dense or as fast because of the spectrum. You do what's called massive MIMO, which is the super high dense, high frequency spectrum. That only goes, 1,000 feet, but it goes at lightning speed, 200, 300, 500, 1,000 megs, a gig of speed for that frequency using that type of antenna. And then there's midband, which is obviously the 2.5, 3.5 gigahertz. By the way, there's a major auction happening right now. I think it's already raised $8 billion on what's called C-band spectrum, which is that middle band spectrum. And that is the workhorse. That is going to be the workhorse for 5G. And why Verizon and AT&T are spending a lot. They're both together going to spend $15 billion acquiring that mid-band spectrum, because it is the most important spectrum to deploy 5G. That's why T-Mobile wanted Sprint, because Sprint owned a huge amount of mid-band spectrum. So T-Mobile now doesn't have to spend a whole lot of money on that auction because they've already got most of the mid-band. But so I hope that answers the question, but the technology's been designed, it's being implemented, but it's being implemented in different ways based on the spectrum that has been acquired by these companies to distribute it, meaning in the cities and the denser areas, the speeds will be faster because the antennas don't have to go as far, and the antennas that are placed are very high density antennas. Whereas in suburban areas, you won't get the same connection speed as you get in nodes or commercial areas. The speeds will be a little bit different, a little bit slower, but still way faster than LTE. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Next question from our audience. What kind of innovations will be required to make the 5G investments worth it for these big companies and for the United States as a nation? I guess related to that is an estimate probably of, if it costs $500 billion for 4G, what kind of investments are we looking at for 5G?
So I think a couple things. Number one is that all four companies know that they have to have a very strong value proposition on the quality of their network as it transitions from 4G to 5G. Right now, the only people that can get a 5G signal have the most recent versions of Apple and Samsung phones. And so right now, a very small percentage of people in America actually have a device that can connect to the 5G network. And so over time, as people make the investment in the phones and they begin to start to use the 5G network, we're going to begin to see what people think about it. Right now, unless you want to download a high def movie in 5 seconds instead of 2 minutes on your cell phone, you're not going to have a use for 5G. I mean, you may see a clearer picture on a 5G device, watching the Washington Football Club. But, right now it's really early in the game to understand. We just don't know yet who's going to pay for it. I think that right now, the way that they'll have to fund it over time is going to be to charge a premium for a certain amount of a bucket of 5G megabits. I think that's most likely the way they're going to market it, to be able to fund it. But right now, it's just we're the first two batters of the first inning in the World Series game here on 5G. It's just getting started. But the innovation that will occur, I think, is going to be mind-blowing. Just like we see how 4G has changed our lives in terms of our ability. Look at our ability to work from home during the pandemic, and to be able to get in our car and have a work conversation or a Zoom call in our car. I mean, that could never have happened on 3G. I mean, so I think that we take for granted sometimes how great these networks are, because they're relatively seamless as we go from home, outside, and back. 5G is going to make that line blur even more, whereas we can be anywhere and not even care if we're near a Wi-Fi. Right now, most of us, will struggle until we get to a Wi-Fi signal, and then we feel we can relax, on our connectivity for our devices. With 5G, it's not even going to enter our mind. So the answer is no one knows.
In order to prepare for 5G, what type of installation should landlords focus on with regard to their buildings? Seems like a combo of mid-band and high-band.
Well, in building, it's more going to be, mid-band and high-band. But the problem is right now is who pays for it. Because the wireless companies, unless they've got, let's say, for example, let's say you have, pick a company, Microsoft is in your building, and Microsoft buys all Verizon phones. So they have 4,000 employees using Verizon phones in your building. Well, guess what? Verizon's going to install small cells in your building because they've got a huge contract with Microsoft to make sure those phones function. So unless you have a massive tenant using a lot of one phone, it's going to be hard to get the wireless companies to pay for the enhancements to put that infrastructure inside your building. Again, it's a real challenge because commercial office owners are under a lot of pressure right now from the revenue side. It takes a lot of revenue to install these systems, and the wireless carriers right now just don't want to pay for them. So every building owner's got to kind of make their own decision as to how much they want to invest and how much they believe. There's studies that say that if you have excellent in-building connectivity, your building has a 10% revenue opportunity gain because of the seamless nature of the connectivity. I think equally important is your fiber and having choice of fiber. I was in a building where we had one choice, and that company had a monopoly on what they could charge us for fiber. And so good connectivity means you have lots of choices, there's competition, and when you have 2 or 3 fiber players providing access to your building, then that's a good thing, because that means your tenants have choices. But when it comes to who's going to pay for the neutral host network, who's going to manage it, and who's going to fund the small cells in your building, it's a complicated algorithm based on who's using the network and who has the motivation to make sure that those phones are functioning. Is it the tenant? Is it the network? Or is it the landlord? And each of those cases are very, very unique and different depending upon the circumstance.
Going back to your trips to China, where you had firsthand look at what they're doing, what are the strengths and weaknesses of both China and the United States? What do they each have to win the race for 5G?
Well, you know, they've got to jump on us, obviously, because, you know, I read from Kathy Borden, who's a friend, about, you know, the whole concern about working from home, the 5G speeds, but there's also a lot of fear of 5G. People have done surveys. 20% of the people who are surveyed believe 5G is harmful to them. And I don't know where that comes from. I mean, it's conspiracy theorists. I see it a lot when I'm getting approval for my cell towers, where, you know, people have legitimate concerns that they've read that 5G causes harm, when there's no difference between a 5G signal and a 4G signal from the standpoint of what it does to your body, or 3G signal or 2G signal. I mean, I got that complaint back in 2001 when I first started my business. But as it relates to China, I mean, they've got a huge jump on us because the network's up and it's operating, and more people in China have 5G phones because of Huawei, and they made those phones very affordable. And you know how that happened is, you know, all through a lot of partnership. So the question is, where's the innovation? You know, the innovators. Who are the companies that are investing, the speculative investment, the venture capital to help? So again, I think that it's going to be the brain power of innovative people that are going to be able to begin to see what 5G can do and how it functions. And I think, you know, in many respects, it's going to be multiple hundreds of products that are going to come out of it. But it's just, to me, it's really very early to tell.
I think when you and I talked about this early on, Len, you had mentioned the analogy of 5G being the Autobahn that goes hundreds of miles per hour. And now we need people to step up and fund and manufacture the cars that can go hundreds of miles per hour.
Exactly.
And we're early stages, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Next question. Who is building the data centers in high density areas that you described?
Amazon. And in cell towers, a company called Vapor.io, which manufactures a small style, like a 20 by 15 package data center. And then that's being leased out to companies like Crown Castle and American Tower. And they're selling the rack space inside the data center next to their tower to companies like Verizon and AT&T and so forth. And then Verizon then resells that to companies like Facebook and LinkedIn or Netflix, or companies that have peaks where huge amounts of data are going through that tower at certain times, like the Super Bowl, you know, or the inauguration. You know, let's face it. I mean, every cell tower is going to max out in the inauguration in the downtown DC. And so the data centers next to the towers have effectively helped create lower latency and better user experience. But it's all very, again, the mobile data centers are in the very early stages, and the biggest issue with data centers is power and backup power and heat. So, you know, I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens with suburban office. That's, you know, B buildings and C buildings that are not near metro or not near activity centers. We're all going to see in the next couple of years what the effect of COVID will be on the commercial office sector as to whether or not there will be repurposed buildings for you know, lower demand or higher quality environments where people want to work. And so there may be opportunities, you know, for some of those older buildings to be repurposed for that type of use. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but I got to believe that there's going to be, you know, again, the need for data closer to where the users are.
Next question. How expensive is it to install a small cell antenna inside a multifamily building? And what other devices or infrastructure are required to amplify a 5G signal?
Yep. The key thing on 5G. So if you want to put, let's say you have a 5-story building. I can see Peter Hackett, my friend, has said a 5-story building, 125,000 square feet. Each of those are so okay. So if it's Verizon, for example, and you say to Verizon, look, I've got a great building. I want you in my building, and I'll pay for all of it. All I want you to do is bring your radios, connect into the telco closet, and fire it up, and I'll fund it. I'll pay for the antennas. I'll pay for the wiring. I'll pay for all the chase quarters and so forth. And so you have to sit down and talk to Verizon as to what type of technology they want to use, because Verizon is going to use a different antenna than a T-Mobile antenna or an AT&T antenna or a Dish antenna. And so these antennas aren't. I can tell you that on a typical cell site, I'll give you an example. On a typical cell site where they're going to install 15 antenna panels on my tower, the cost of installing the antennas and the cost of installing the radios is somewhere in the neighborhood of $300,000-$400,000, and that is the equivalent of roughly 20 small cells. So you can kind of do the math on how that breaks down. Again, it just depends on the user and what type of equipment they're using, but it's in the tens of thousands, it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending upon how many nodes you need. But I don't really have the math, Peter, on exactly what that would be. But I know that if you talk to Crown Castle, who does this, American Tower, they have companies that will give you estimates on what this costs, and they'll do it. I think they do it for free too. And then you have choices, whether you want to do your own neutral host system. A neutral host system is one set of antennas that can function for all the wireless carriers. But the carriers are not as keen on neutral host because they don't operate it. Somebody else operates it. So if it goes down for all 4 carriers, and they don't like that. So they'd rather have control of the network and put their own devices. But then you have a labyrinth of wires run through your ceilings for 4 different companies. So there's a lot of factors you got to think about in terms of allowing small cells versus neutral host, which is a lot cleaner.
Okay, next question. Does 5G have any implications regarding improved voice call reception quality?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's again lower latency, higher speed, crystal clear. Yeah, it's mind blowing how much better it will be, and what the user experience will be.
Discussion. Do you think COVID and working from home will have any impact on speeding up the innovation and deployment of 5G?
I think that we are experiencing right now a paradigm shift in. We talked about this earlier. A paradigm shift in the way we think about work and the way we think about where we work. Because work is no longer a place; it's what we create. And an office space is a place where we collaborate, where we share relationships, where we create culture, and be informed teams of people that like each other. You can do it on a Zoom call, but in the end, really, where we work is where we share, I think. And we've all learned in the last 9 months that we can work from anywhere, as long as we have good connectivity, whether it's a wireless connectivity or whether it's a fiber connectivity. I think that there's no question that the better the signal, the faster the connection, the lower the latency, the more productive we're all going to be. And that there's going to be a case for the capability of what we can or can't do. And we're going to see how it rolls out. We're going to see how Microsoft redesigns their tools to use 5G. We're going to see a lot of innovation on the way in which we conduct business. We see it now in our apps. I mean, I can buy an airplane ticket on my phone faster than I can on my computer. I can change my seat a lot faster on my phone than I can on my computer. And so, 4G and cloud computing allowed me to do that. I can buy, if I think of something, I can buy it on Amazon on my phone in one click instead of having to go turn on my computer, log in, So what's happening is that LTE and 4G, along with cloud computing and incredibly well thought out apps, have changed the way we behave and changed the way our phone is now, unfortunately, it's now one of the most important, or fortunately, the most important devices we have for communicating, for transacting business, for sharing information and so forth. And it's running on, on a network that's, pretty good, but about to get much, much better. And so to me, I think that the neatest thing about the future is the innovation that's going to occur as a result of 5G. But it's really, it's like I said, it's very, very early in the game, in terms of what it's going to mean. And we hope and pray that it'll all happen, here in the United States.
Next question, what can a local government do to support the race for 5G?
Oh my God. Review our applications fast. Be positive about ways that is speed. Everything is how long it takes to get done. Help us implement and create the policies that allow for it. Just decide what you want it to look like, and then make it uniform. And in Virginia, they passed a law 4 years ago that rolled out 5G and rolled out small cells in the right of way. In Maryland, they have yet to do that. Maryland is going to be the last of the game in building out the 5G network because they can't make the elected officials can't decide at the state how to do it, and so figure that out. Look at what's happening in other parts of the country. Look at what other states are doing. Half the states in the country have passed legislation to allow for small cells to be deployed. And so I think that the first thing that agencies and states and municipalities can do is to decide how they want it to look and where they want it to be, and make those decisions and then move on and let the industry pick it up and run with it. And that's not happening in a lot of America. Unlike China, there's no debate on 5G in China. It just gets done. It just gets built. Not saying we'd be China, because you want to have input, but that's why they're ahead. It's because they don't have the transparency that we have on debating these things. So that, to me, is I think one of the most important things they can do.
And then there's a follow-up question from Peter, I guess related to your comment that 5G will first be rolled out in denser areas like downtown DC, Tyson's, Reston. Do you think that will make Class B suburban office buildings not near metro even more obsolete because of the arrival of 5G and the concentration on those other kinds of locations?
I think that we live in a world today where culture of a lot of the workforce, they don't want to drive cars. They want to be on metro. They want to be in nodes. They want to be able to walk to food. They want to be able to socialize, and they want their phones to work really well, and they want their networks to be functional. And I think that suburban offices got a lot more problems than just wireless connectivity in terms of being competitive. But yeah, there's no question that it's a very simple equation. The wireless companies invest in places where they get a return on their investment. The return on the investment is how many users are using the network and how much data is flowing through those phones. And that's why the digital divide in rural areas is such a conundrum, because there's no money in it to build ubiquitous wireless service everywhere in the United States. You have to subsidize those low density areas. The high density areas are the places that get fed because that's where the revenue is. So the revenue is where the people are. People are in the denser areas, that's where the revenue is. And so that's where the investment comes. That's where the first, the new thing comes. It's going to happen where there's the highest density. But on the other hand, in a COVID world, the places that we thought were the highest density are no more. But we'll make the transition back to that over time.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for their questions. We're soon to be out of time. I'd like to thank Len for joining us today and sharing his insights on, like you mentioned, this fast changing world of wireless innovation, and clearly the impact that it's going to have on the built environment and on real estate investment and development. This program has been recorded, so we will be sharing the link to the audience and those that registered. You should get an email probably tomorrow with the link to the recording for this program. So again, thank you, Len, for sharing your evening with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this. It was really a pleasure.
So just two quick announcements. We're now accepting applications for our fall 2021 class for our Masters in Real Estate Development. Go to realestate.gmu.edu and join us on January 28th for our upcoming webinar on scaling the cloud, the hyper-evolution of data centers, very much related to the topic that Len spoke tonight. We'll have a leading executive from Microsoft talking about their thoughts about the future of data centers, certainly an important topic for our local economy. So again, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you at a future George Mason real estate education event. Thank you, everybody.